I have told this story once in official testimony. I have told it 3 times in private, to people I trusted completely. I am telling it now because the records have been partially declassified, because the people who were in that chamber are mostly dispersed or retired, and because I was there, and I am tired of the sanitized version that keeps appearing in the supplements and the commemorative texts. The supplements say General Aldous presented a formal accounting of the Dominion's violations. They say she delivered a measured diplomatic response. They use words like firm and principled and effective. None of those words are wrong. Exactly. They just describe a different event than the one I attended. What I attended was 31 names read aloud in a room that had not expected to hear them. I should back up. My name is Petra Solnay. At the time of the events I am describing, I was 29 years old and held the rank of 3rd attaché to Ambassador Halvard Oss's mission to the Kyrath Dominion. My function was primarily administrative. I drafted correspondence, maintained the delegation's filing protocols, coordinated scheduling with our Kyrath counterparts, and kept the cipher logs. I was not a policy mind. I was not a strategist. I was organized. I was careful with details. And I had a talent for being in rooms without being noticed, which turned out to be the most useful thing I possessed. I had been attached to the Halvard mission for 14 months when the Ardent was destroyed. I will not linger on that. Ardent was a diplomatic courier, a small vessel, lightly crewed, carrying a sealed packet from Earth Central to our station on Vethkara, standard run. It had made the transit 12 times without incident. On its 13th run, Kyrath Patrol Intercept Vessel identified it as an unlicensed craft operating within contested approach corridors and seized it. That was the language in the official communique the Kyrath Senate released 48 hours after the fact. There were 9 people aboard the Ardent. Envoy Cassett Harlow, who had been a diplomat for 22 years, was among them. The sealed packet, the Ardent, carrying, contained, among other things, a set of proposed revisions to the Third Compact that would have formalized trade protections that Kyrath had been requesting for 7 years. The Kyrath Senate released a follow-up communique 11 days later. It clarified that the navigational seizure had concluded, and that the crew of the unlicensed vessel had been processed and remanded. It did not specify where they had been remanded to. It did not provide names. We already knew, of course. Our intelligence office had its own sources, and those sources had already told us what processed and remanded meant in the operational dialect of the Kyrath Patrol Fleet. Ambassador Halvard had sent 3 formal requests for clarification and received 3 formal non-responses. She was preparing a 4th when she died. That was the other thing I have not mentioned. Ambassador Halvard Oss died 11 days after the Ardent incident, a stroke, according to the station medical staff. She was 64 years old and had been in declining health for 2 years. The timing was coincidental. I believe that. I also believe that she had been carrying the weight of those 9 names for 11 days, and that it is possible to die of a weight, like that when you are 64, and the machine you have spent your career building has just demonstrated, publicly and without apology, that it will not hold. Deputy Chief Envoy Morris took interim charge of the mission. He was a careful man, and a frightened one, and those 2 qualities are not always compatible. He sent a 5th request for clarification. He began drafting language for a potential withdrawal of non-essential staff. He asked me twice, in the space of a week, whether I thought the Kyrath Senate intended to formalize the seizure as a precedent. I told him I didn't know. I didn't. Nobody in our delegation did. We were operating in a silence that the Kyrath Senate had constructed deliberately, and silence, when a government deploys it as a tool, is its own form of communication. What it communicated in this case was that they did not feel they needed to answer us. I want to be honest about what those weeks felt like from the inside, because I think it matters for understanding why Aldous walked through the door the way she did. We were not afraid exactly, or rather, fear was not the primary thing. It was present, but it sat underneath something else, something harder to name. It was the feelings of a conversation that had been going on for 11 years, and that had, at regular intervals, required us to simply absorb something that the other party had done, and then continue the conversation as though that absorption was normal, as though the thing that had been done was a minor note in the margin of an otherwise productive engagement. We had done that absorption 11 times in 11 years. We had done it because that was the job, because the alternative was a rupture that nobody in authority had yet decided to authorize, because the people above us in the chain believed, not without reason, that sustained engagement was better than none, and that the alternative to sustained engagement was something considerably worse. The problem with that kind of calculation is that it compounds. Every time you absorb the thing and continue, you have demonstrated that the absorption is available. The other party takes note. The interval between incidents shortens slightly, or the incidents grow larger slightly, and you absorb those too, and the conversation continues, and the next incident comes. After 11 years and 31 incidents, the Kyrith Senate had a very precise understanding of what the word incident cost them, was the 48 hours it took to draft a communique. Morris understood this. He was not a fool. He simply did not have the authority to change the calculation on his own. And the people who did have that authority were, from his perspective, taking a long time to decide. I do not know exactly what they decided. I know what arrived. General Marin Aldous arrived on Veth Kara 43 days after the Ardent was destroyed. She arrived without announcement. That was the first thing I remember. Not her face, not her rank insignia, but the absence of any advance notice in the scheduling system. I had been maintaining that system for 14 months. I had logged every arrival of every Earth personnel above the rank of specialist. That Aldous was not in it. She simply appeared at the delegation suite at 0630 station time, presented her credentials to the corridor security post, and walked in carrying a flat document case and nothing else. She was 57 years old. She had a broad, weathered face, and the kind of posture that does not come from military discipline alone. It comes from years of a specific decision to occupy space, without apology. Her hair was gray, cut short, and she wore a general's uniform without any of the supplementary decorations that officers of her rank typically accumulated. Aldous had accumulated them. She simply did not wear them. I found out later that she considered decorations on working dress an administrative distraction. Her words. She walked into the conference room where Morris had been holding his morning briefings, set the document case on the table, and sat down in the chair that had been Ambassador Halvard's. Nobody said anything about that. I noticed several people starting to say something and then not. Morris said, "General, we weren't informed you were." "No," Aldous said. "You weren't." She opened the document case and set a single piece of paper on the table, folded once down the center. She did not look at it. She looked at Morris. "The session with the Senate Standing Panel convenes at 1400. I'll be attending." "You're welcome to bring your staff," Morris said. "General, with respect, the session is a routine administrative review. The Kyrith have indicated they want to." "I know what the Kyrith have indicated," Aldous said. She did not say it sharply. She said it the way you would correct a mathematical error, without heat, without impatience, just a gentle redirect from the wrong answer toward the right one. "I also know what they've done. Those are two different things. The session is at 1400. She glanced at me. I had been standing near the door with a clipboard, and I was, as I mentioned, good at not being noticed. She noticed me anyway. "You." "What's your function?" I told her I was third attaché, administrative. "Good," she said. "Bring something to write with." "Not a recording device. Something to write with." I did not ask why. I said yes, and she went back to the document case, and that was the end of my introduction to General Marin Aldous. I have been asked many times what I made of her in that first meeting. People expect a specific kind of answer, something about presence, something about the quality of command. What I tell them is simpler than that. What I made of her in that first meeting was that she had already decided what was going to happen. Not in the sense of arrogance, not in the sense of recklessness. In the technical sense. The decision had been made. She was not attending the 1400 session to make it. She was attending to execute it. That distinction matters. I have worked with people who confuse decisiveness with certainty, and the confusion produces disasters. Aldous was not certain of outcomes. She was certain of what she was going to do. Those are not the same thing, and she knew the difference. And that knowing was the clearest thing in the room when she sat in Ambassador Halvard's chair and did not explain herself. In the 3 hours between that meeting and the session, Aldous did two things that I witnessed. The first was that she asked Morris for the complete file on the Ardent. Not the intelligence summary, not the formatted brief, but the raw file, every document in it. Morris gave her the access code, and she sat in the conference room for 90 minutes reading through it. She did not take notes. She did not ask questions. When she was done, she closed the file and went to get something to eat from the staff kitchen, and she came back with a cup of something that I think was tea. And she sat and drank it and looked at the document case with the paper in it. I passed the conference room twice during that 90 minutes, on errands of my own. The second time I passed it, I slowed down enough to look through the glass panel in the door. She was near the end of the file by then. I could tell by the scroll position on terminal. Her face was the same as it had been in the briefing. Not closed, not rigid, not the performed composure of someone managing an emotion in public. Just settled. The way a person's face is when they have already done the thing they needed to do internally, and the reading is simply confirmation of what they held. I kept walking. I did not slow down again. The second thing she did was find me in the corridor and ask me how well I knew the layout of the Senate chamber. I told her I had been in it 11 times. I described the seating arrangement, the panel tier positions, the entrance protocols, where the Kyrath delegation typically sat relative to ours, where the parliamentary record station was positioned. She listened to all of it without interruption. When I was done, she asked one question, whether there was a water feature in or near the chamber. I said there was one in the main corridor outside, not in the chamber itself. She nodded. She said, "Good." Then she went back to the conference room. I have thought about that question many times. I still do not entirely understand it. What I think, and this is only my reading, is that she was asking about the acoustic environment. The water feature in the main corridor of Vethkara made a sound like low, continuous rain. It was a Kirith design element, built into the station's concourse as something between an aesthetic choice and a status marker. The slow movement of water was expensive to maintain in a space station, and the Kirith Senate knew it. But the sound carried, and in a room that was quiet, in a conversation that had gone quiet, a sound like rain in a corridor is a very specific thing to hear. I think she wanted to know whether that would be part of the silence after she out. It was. We all heard it. We had 6 staff members in our delegation at the time. Horace kept 2 back. His administrative deputy and the junior cipher officer, both of whom had personal or medical reasons for being available at the suite. The rest of us went to the 1400 session. Aldous walked ahead of the group. She did not brief us. She did not tell us what to expect. When I came up alongside her in the corridor and asked if there was anything I should prepare, she looked at me and said, "Your handwriting. It should be legible." It was a 20-minute walk from the delegation suite to the Senate's reception complex, and I spent most of it trying to calculate what I was walking into. The standing for Interspecies Administrative Review was not a glamorous body. It handled scheduling disputes, tariff classifications, crew certification equivalencies, the administrative debris of 2 civilizations whose record-keeping systems had been incompatible for 11 years. The Kirith used it as a theater. Every session began with a 30-minute procedural preamble in which the panel's presiding chancellor, a tall, slate-gray humanoid named Vreth, who wore his status markings in a band across his throat, would enumerate the agenda items with what I can only describe as the satisfaction of a man who had been given a large gavel and very little else to work with. The Kyrath delegation always arrived before us. They always arranged themselves with the panel members between us and them. The geometry of the room was designed to communicate something about the relative positions of the parties, and Chancellor Brett had spent 11 years perfecting it. When we walked in, the geometry was exactly as usual. P and Gentum sits in their tiered positions. The Kyrath delegation was arranged at the far end of the table, their hierarchy communicated by proximity to Vreth's chair. There were 12 of them. There were 5 of us. That ratio was also usual. What was not usual was Aldous. She walked in and sat down at our end of the table without waiting for the seating protocols. Was technically a violation of Kirath parliamentary custom. The custom required the junior party to stand until the presiding chancellor acknowledged them. Aldous sat down. She placed the document case on the table and set the folded paper on top of it. She did not look at Vreth. She did not look at the Kirath delegation. She appeared, from where I was sitting, to be looking at a point slightly above and to the left of the far wall, as though she was tracking something that no one else in the room could see. I took my seat at the edge of the delegation block, opened my notebook, and uncapped the first pen. Vreth began the preamble. I will not reproduce it in full. It ran to approximately 40 minutes, which was longer than usual, and I believe the extra time was devoted to a careful elaboration of the navigational seizure incident and its resolution. Vreth described the tent, Ardent, as an unregistered courier vessel operating under ambiguous diplomatic classification. That was new language. Previous communiques had said unlicensed and noted that the incident had been resolved in accordance with Kirath Dominion Port and Transit protocols, with relevant parties processed under applicable crew certification standards. There was a 5-minute subsection about crew certification standards. There was a footnote, read aloud, about the applicable regulations. At no point during any of this did Vreth mention Envoy Cassett Harlow by name. At no point did he mention any of the 9 people aboard Ardent by name. Aldous listened to all of it. Her posture did not change. Her expression did not change. She had her hands flat on the table, on either side of the folded paper, and she did not move them. And she looked at the far wall, with the same quality of attention she had been looking at it with since we sat down. There was nothing aggressive in it. There was nothing impatient. There was simply nothing performing anything for anyone in the room. It was. I realized after a few minutes the quality of attention of someone who is waiting for a process they understand completely to finish, so that they can begin the thing they actually came to do. When the preamble was complete, Vreth said, "Panel recognizes the Earth delegation and invites a response." This was the standard invitation. It meant we had 30 minutes by Kirath parliamentary protocol to address the items on the agenda. Morris had prepared a response. I had helped him draft it. It ran to 14 pages and addressed each of the agenda items with the careful, respectful language of a party that was very concerned about the Ardent incident and very committed to a process of structured dialogue. Aldous did not look at Morris. She looked at Vreth and said, "Thank you, Chancellor." Then she picked up the folded paper and opened it. I know what that paper said. I have a copy of it in my personal files, and I have read it enough times that I no longer need to read it to recall it. It was handwritten, Aldous' own hand, plain and regular, slightly larger than average, the letters of someone who writes for legibility rather than style. There were 2 columns of text. The left column contained dates. The right column contained names. Aldous read from the right column. Envoy Cassett Harlow, she said. Communications Officer Devon Saris. Navigator First Class Yelm Tow. Cargo Specialist Riamant. Engineers Mate Poole. Engineers Mate Wesson. Engineers Mate Cadell. Medic Trainee Orsic. Courier Aide Benefalst. She paused. The room was quiet in the way a room gets quiet when something unexpected has happened, and no one is yet sure what to do about it. Vreth had his hands folded on the table. 2 of the panel members were looking at each other. The lead member of the Kirath delegation, a heavy-set figure named Holeth, their equivalent of an undersecretary, was very still. Aldous said, "Shh. Those are the 9 crew members of the diplomatic courier. Ardent. Destroyed in transit on the 31st of last Tertian cycle. For the record," she looked back at the paper. "Diplomatic Liaison Cord Bennis," she said. "Communications Specialist Pelagat. Survey Technician Ray. Survey Technician Hale. Survey Technician Dubras. Vessel Master First Class Onnenreich." Another pause. She was not reading quickly. She was reading at the pace of a person who intends every name to occupy the space it is given. Each name had the same weight as the one before it. She did not inflect them for the room. She did not slow down at the more prominent names or rush through the junior ones. Cassett Harlow, 22 years of diplomatic service, received the same weight as engineer's mate Cadell, whose file I later looked up, and who had been 23 years old and on his first deep transit. The same weight. That was intentional. I understood that, even in the room, even at 29 years old, with a pen in my hand, and no authority to understand anything, those are 6 members of the survey team aboard the Tessin, impounded in the Kareth approach corridor in the 9th month of year 11. Vessel was released after 47 days. Personnel were not aboard the vessel at the time of release. She moved down the paper. Border Post Crew, Relay Station 7 Kale, Year 9. Personnel, she read the names. Communications Array Station Morn, Year 8, Year 6. She read those names. Diplomatic Courier. Saril. Year 7. 3 names, Supply Vessel. Hounder. Year 5. 2 names, I was writing. I had brought a notebook and 2 pens as she had asked. I was writing every name she read, in the order she read it, and I was writing the dates from the left column as she gave them. The act of writing was the only thing anchoring me to the room. You need to understand what was happening. Or rather, what was not happening. There was no argument. There was no presentation of evidence. There was no formal accusation, no demand for response, no procedural maneuver. There was a woman reading names from a list at a table in a room. And the names were the names of Earth people who had passed through Kyrath space in the last 11 years and not come back. And every single name was on the Kyrath Dominion's official record, the internal records, the ones their Senate maintained for their own administrative use, the ones that were supposed to be sealed. Our intelligence services had obtained them over the course of 4 years. They were accurate. Aldous knew they were accurate. So did Holith. So, increasingly, did Vreth. I know Vreth knew because I watched his face. The status markings on his throat, biological markers that the Kirith could not fully suppress, that darkened or shifted with physiological states they did not always intend to communicate, began to change somewhere around the 7th name. Not dramatically. A deepening, a slight compression of the chromatophore tissue that ran along the lateral band below his jaw. It was the Kyrath equivalent of a man whose hands have gone still, in a way that has nothing to do with calm. I had been attending sessions for 14 months. I had learned to read that shift he did not interrupt. Neither did Holith, neither did anyone. Medical Courier. Arden, Pale. 4. 2 names, Civilian Survey Contractor. Transit Corridor 7 Year 3. 1 name. Trade Attaché Sorel Mies. Detained during First Contact Consultations Year 1. Released after 88 days. Returned to duty. Retired from service Year 8. A beat. She's alive. I want that noted. She retired to a farm outside Port Cowan and she grows. I believe it's barley. I don't know why I know that. I do know it. It's barley. Nobody said anything. I remember thinking, in that moment, that the barley comment was the most human thing in the room. Not soft. It was not soft, but specific in a way that all the formal language of 11 years of diplomatic record had never been. Cassette Harlow had been an envoy. Sorel Mies had been a trade attaché. On paper they were functions. On the paper in Aldis's hand they were a name attached to a date, attached to a duration and a resolution, and then one of them was a farm outside Port Cowan. And something growing in the ground, and that specificity did something to the room that the 30 previous names had built toward, without quite reaching. Aldis looked back at the paper. She finished the list. The last 3 names were from a cargo inspection incident in Year 2 that the Kirith had classified internally as a crew processing variance. The people involved had been held for 16 days. All 3 had eventually been returned. All 3 were, as of the time Aldis was reading their names, alive and somewhere in Earth space. She read all 3 names. Then she folded the paper once down the center, the way it had been folded when she set it on the document case. She set it on the table. E1 names, she said. Over 11 years. Some of your records classify the incidents differently from others. Some use detainee. Some use processed. Some use navigational seizure. Some use language I can't repeat in a formal session, because it is not the kind of language a Dominion Senate should be comfortable hearing out loud. She was still addressing Vreth, and her voice had not changed at all. The names are the names. The people are the people. The records are your records. Vreth said, General, The panel must note that several of the incidents you have referenced are resolved, Aldous said. I know, that's your word. I understand what it means in your administrative record. It means the incident is closed. The file is marked. The matter is considered finished. She picked up the folded paper and put it in the document case. 31 names. 11 years. I wanted the panel to hear them. She looked at the paper case for a moment, then at the wall, then, slowly, without hurry, at Vreth. Ardent. Carried 9 people and a diplomatic packet. The packet proposed trade protections your government has been requesting since year 4. Ambassador Halvard was going to present them in this room. She died before she could do that. I think she died, in part, because she was trying to find a way to continue having this conversation, in a way that didn't require me to sit in this room and read you a list. She was better at this than I am. She spent 34 years finding better ways. She paused. I did not find a better way. I tried. This is what I have. The room was still very quiet. I was still writing. My hand hurt. I kept writing. I am going to tell you something now, Aldous said, and I want to be very clear that I am not threatening you. I am not issuing an ultimatum. I am not giving you a deadline. I am not making any kind of demand. She took a breath. It was not a theatrical breath. It was the breath of someone who is about to say something they have thought about for a long time and have not said yet. What I am doing is describing a situation that already exists, in the hope that describing it accurately might be useful to you and to your Senate. The situation is this. Earth has been having a conversation with the Kyrath Dominion for 11 years. We have used the standard forms of that conversation, the requests, the sessions, the communiques, the protocols. We have used them because we prefer them, not because they are the only thing we have. The Dominion has tested, on 31 occasions across 11 years, what happens when the standard forms are set aside. Those tests produce the names I just read. The pattern they establish is clear. She looked at Holeth. Holeth did not move. Earth Central has authorized me to tell you that we have concluded our review of that pattern, and that our assessment is complete, and that we have communicated our findings to the appropriate departments. That is all I am in a position to say about the assessment. I will say one other thing which is also accurate. She stood. I had not expected her to stand yet. She was barely 2/3 through the time that Kyrath parliamentary protocol allotted. She stood anyway. 31 names in 11 years. We remember all of them. Every single one. The barley farmer and the envoy and the cargo specialist and the medic trainee and all 26 others. We have not forgotten any of them, and we will not. She picked up the document case. Thank you for your time, Chancellor. She walked out. I looked at Morris. Morris was looking at his 14-page prepared response. He closed it. We walked out. In the antechamber, just outside the Senate doors, Kyrath Protocol Officer, young, in the pale gray administrative robe they gave the junior staff, was waiting with the standard post-session documentation packet. He held it out. Aldous looked at it, then at him. She did not take it. He stood there for a moment and then withdrew it. And his status markings, lighter and less developed than Vreth's, made a small shift that I had learned enough to read as confusion. She walked past him. We followed. In the corridor, nobody said anything for a while. There was a water feature along the right-hand wall of the main corridor on Vethkara. Not water exactly, but a Kyrath design element, channel of some slow-moving fluid that ran the length of the station's main concourse and made a sound like low rain. We walked past it. I listened to it. Aldous was walking slightly ahead of us. She had the document case under her arm. Pace was what it had been on the way in. Steady, deliberate, not fast. She paused at an intersection, checked the directional sigils on the wall, turned left toward the delegation suite wing. I caught up to her. I don't know why. It was not my place to. I caught up anyway. I said, General, the trade protection packet. She looked at me sideways, the one that... Ardent. Carrying, I said. The one Ambassador Halvard was going to present. We still have the terms. I drafted the cover letter. The proposal is still valid. The Kyrath Trade Ministry has been requesting those protections for 7 years. If there's a way forward, if there's a diplomatic track that doesn't close, the packet is still there. She walked 3 more steps before she answered. I know, she said. Then, Then I hope they read what we've left on the table, she said. And I hope they calculate whether what they've been doing for 11 years is worth what it costs from here forward. That calculation is theirs to make. She glanced at me. Were you taking down the names? I said yes. I showed her the notebook. She looked at it for a moment. She didn't ask to see it, just looked at it. Good, she said, file it. Full transcript certified. Into the mission record. I did. That evening Morris called a staff meeting and tried to figure out what had happened. He was not wrong to try. He was the interim head of mission. He needed to understand what an officer, with no formal standing in his mission, had done, in the room his mission was responsible for, and what it meant for the diplomatic situation he was managing. I sat in the back of that meeting and answered the questions he put to me, which were mostly about the sequence of events and the Kirith delegation's response and what Aldous had said in the corridor afterward. I did not offer opinions. I was a third attaché. I filed things and I wrote things down. What I privately thought was that Morris was asking the right questions for the wrong meeting. The meeting that mattered was happening somewhere else. Several somewhere elses, probably. In the offices of Kirith Senate members, who had been in that room, or who had been told what happened in that room. In the Intelligence Directorate of the Dominion government, where our internal records, which they had always assumed were limited to what we had chosen to share, had just been demonstrated, in public, without elaboration or explanation, to be considerably more complete than that. In the offices of the Kirith Trade Ministry, which had wanted those protections for 7 years, and was now re-evaluating the cost of the arrangement that had prevented them from getting them. The appropriate department's comment was deliberate. Aldous had said she had communicated Earth's assessment to the appropriate departments, and she had said it in a way that communicated precisely the people in the room were not those departments, that the session they were sitting in was not the venue where the assessment would manifest, and that whatever came next would not look like the last 11 years. She had not specified what it would look like. She did not need to. The Kirith Senate was good at reading implications. They had been reading implications for 11 years. They simply had not, until that afternoon, been required to read implications that pointed in a direction they had not controlled. I do not know everything that happened in the days that followed. I was not senior enough to be in most of those conversations, and Morris made the reasonable decision to limit information flow while the situation was unclear. What I know is what I observed and what became visible from my position. On the third day after the session, Holith requested a private meeting with Morris. Morris agreed. I was not in that meeting. Morris told me afterward that Holith had raised, in an exploratory and entirely preliminary way, the question of whether the trade protection terms the Ardent had been carrying were still available for discussion. Morris had told him they were still available. On the 7th day, 2 of the Kirith Senate's panel members resigned from the Standing Administrative Review Committee. The Kirith Communications Office issued a statement describing the resignations as voluntary administrative restructuring. 2 members who resigned were the ones who had been present at the most incidents in Aldous's list, the ones whose administrative signatures appeared on the largest number of the Dominion's internal records. I knew this because I had access to the mission's intelligence files. Do not think it was a coincidence. On the 11th day, the Kirith Senate's Foreign Relations Ministry issued a communique acknowledging administrative irregularities in the handling of the Ardent incident and announcing that an internal review had been commissioned. The communique was 4 paragraphs long. The 3rd paragraph contained a sentence about the importance of clear and consistent protocols for the processing of diplomatic courier vessels. It was not an apology. It was the kind of language that a government produces when it is doing something that resembles an apology as closely as it can manage without using the word. I filed it. I filed everything. On the 14th day, General Aldous left Vethkara. She did not convene a farewell meeting. She appeared at the suite at 08 with Undima, spoke briefly with Morris, and departed. On her way out, she stopped in the corridor where I was sorting correspondence and said, "The notebook, is it filed?" I said it was. Good. She looked at me for a moment. You have good instincts, she said. Not everyone would have asked about the trade packet. I said I had just been doing my job. That's not quite right, she said. Doing your job was writing things down when I asked. What you did was notice that the door hadn't closed and ask whether it was still worth walking through. She seemed to think about something. That's a different skill. Don't waste it filing things. She left. I thought about that for a long time. I think about it still, occasionally, though I have been doing considerably more than filing things for most of the years since. What she meant, I eventually understood, was that diplomacy runs on two tracks in parallel, and people who can only run one of them are useful up to a point. One track is the formal process, the sessions, the communiques, the protocols, the careful language of parties maintaining a posture. The other track is the thing underneath the posture, the actual calculation of cost and benefit that the posture is constructed to manage. Morris was very good at the formal track. Aldous was reading the other one. What she saw in me, I think, was not talent. I had no talent for the kind of thing she did, but a refusal to let the formal track convince me that the other one didn't exist. When I asked about the trade packet, I was asking whether the other track was still open. It was the right question at the right moment, and I had asked it for the right reason, which was that I believed Ambassador Halvard had wanted it to be open, and I was not ready to close it on her behalf. I thought about that on the 32nd day, when the Kirith Dominion's Border Security Command announced the temporary reassignment of Troll assets from 3 sectors of the approach corridors, the 3 sectors where the Ardent had been intercepted, where the Tessin had been impounded, where 6 of the 11 years documented incidents had occurred. The reassignment was announced as routine fleet rotation. It was also, by the most precise possible calculation, the first time in 11 years that Earth vessels in those corridors would not face Kirith. Intercept vessels, the timing was exact. I do not think fleet rotation is ever that exact by accident. I filed the report, I noted the date. I noted which corridor sectors were affected and which patrol designations had been reassigned. I cross-referenced them against the incident list and confirmed, in a margin note that I did not put in the formal report, but kept in my working file, the overlap was complete. Every sector from which a Kirith patrol had been withdrawn was a sector where an incident in Aldous' list had occurred, not coincidence, calculation. They had done the math on what the list meant, and had told them something about the state of the other track, and they had made the corresponding adjustment in posture. That is how it works, when it works. The formal track continues, meetings are held, communiques are issued, the language of bilateral engagement proceeds. While underneath it, the actual calculus shifts and the posture adjusts, and the thing you are trying to prevent does not happen again. I sat at my desk for a while after filing the report and looked at the notebook. 31 names, in handwriting that was plain and regular and slightly larger than average and legible. The dates in the left column, the names in the right, the way Aldous had read them. Without heat, without theatrics, without the 32-page rebuttal or the 14-page prepared response or the 5 formal requests for clarification that had received 5 formal non-responses. Just the names, just the fact of them, occupying the room the way the dead occupy the rooms of the living when someone has the discipline to let them. I have been asked, in the years since, whether I believe that what Aldous did in that room was a form of threat. I have been asked by people who mean the question sincerely, and by people who are hoping I will say yes, so that they can file the answer in the appropriate category and proceed accordingly. What I tell them is this. I was in the room. I heard every word she said. She was very clear, at the beginning of her concluding remarks, that she was not threatening anyone. She said she was not issuing an ultimatum. She said she was not giving anyone a deadline. She was describing a situation that already existed. I believe she was telling the truth. It was not a threat. A threat implies a future action that is contingent on the other party's response. What Aldous described was not contingent. The assessment was complete. The appropriate departments had been informed. The situation was already in motion. The room she was in was not the room where those things would manifest. She was describing the weather, not creating it. The distinction matters because threats can be countered. Threats can be called. Threats create a negotiating position. What Aldous presented was not a negotiating position. It was a set of facts arranged in chronological order, ending with a description of a process that had already happened, would continue to happen, and would produce whatever it produced regardless of whether the Kirith Senate found it comfortable or not. There was nothing to negotiate about that. There was nothing to rebut. The Kirith Senate did not file a rebuttal. In 31 years of diplomatic records I have reviewed and filed and obtained, I have never found any document that constitutes a formal Dominion response to General Aldis's statement in the Imperial Senate chamber. Have looked, not obsessively, but occasionally, when a new set of records becomes available or a declassified file crosses my desk, it is not there. The Dominion classified the session under an administrative review designation, and the record ends with the recess call that Chancellor Vreth issued approximately 40 seconds after Aldis walked out. The trade protection terms were finalized 16 months after the session. Kirith Foreign Relations Ministry signed them in a ceremony that was described in their official commemorative record as a natural conclusion to 11 years of productive bilateral engagement. I filed that document too. I filed it next to the one that described the Ardent incident as a navigational seizure of an unlicensed vessel. I find it useful to keep them adjacent. Ambassador Halvard Oss is buried on her home station, in the Civil Memorial section. I have been there twice. Her service record, which runs to 4 pages in the official summary and 12 in the full account, does not mention General Aldis. It mentions the Ardent incident in 2 lines. It mentions the trade protection terms in 1. The summary characterizes her career as distinguished by consistent and patient commitment to constructive dialogue. That is accurate. That is also, and I think she would agree with this, not quite the whole thing. She was trying to find a better way. She spent 34 years finding better ways. She was good at it. The list needed to be read anyway. Someone had to sit down in that room and read it. The names were real. They had always been real. Careful language and formal protocols, and the good faith of a woman who died before she saw the trade terms signed, had not made them any less real, and they would have remained unread, properly, formally, occupying a room for another 11 years, and another after that, without someone who had already found every better way and determined that none of them were adequate to this. Aldis found the only way that was left. I don't know if that's a good story. I don't know if it resolves into something comfortable. I know it's what happened. I know I was in the room. I know I wrote 31 names in a notebook and filed it in the mission record, and that the file is still there, in the archive, accessible to anyone with the appropriate clearance. Marin Aldis retired 8 years after the Veth-Kara session. She lives, as far as I know, in the northern coastal settlements on her homeworld. She has declined several requests for public comment on the session, including one from the group producing the commemorative retrospective in which the sanitized version appears. She has declined, as far as I can tell, every request of that kind. She agreed to the official testimony because it was mandatory. She has not said anything on the record since. I find that appropriate. The last time I spoke to her was at a mission reunion, 7 years after Veth-Kara. It was an informal gathering. Someone had found a photograph of the full Halvard mission staff, pre-Ardent, and had it printed and framed. And we stood and frowned it and said the things people say at that kind of event. Aldis was there because Moeris had invited her, and because she had some connection to the mission that I did not fully understand. Halvard had known her, I think, for a long time before the end, and I think Aldis had come partly because of that. I ended up next to her in front of the photograph. I didn't plan it. She looked at the photograph for a long time. There was a version of Halvard in it, younger, before the decline, standing at the back with the easy posture of someone who had been in enough photographs to stop caring about them. Aldis looked at that version of Halvard for a while before she looked at anything else. I looked too. In the photograph, Halvard was mid-sentence, or mid-law. It was hard to tell. The image had caught her at the edge of one thing or the other, and it looked like both at once. That was accurate, I thought. That was right. Then she looked at me. She said, "Did you ever go through the packet, the trade terms?" I said I had. I had spent 2 weeks on the implementation logistics, 2 years after the session, when the terms moved to the finalization stage. She said, "Barley tariffs were in there." I said yes. Among the agricultural protections, a full tariff reclassification that benefited about 400 Earthside producers, includes getting settled in the coastal settlements near Port Cowan. She said, "Good." And she looked back at the photograph. "The farm," she said after a moment, "outside Port Cowan. I did look it up after I got home. It's been running for 12 years now. I don't know why that matters to me, but it does." I said I understood why. She looked at me briefly, the way she had looked at me in the corridor on Veth Kara when I had asked about the trade packet. "I know you do," she said. Then she went back to looking at the photograph. And after a while someone brought refreshments, and the evening continued in the ordinary way that evenings at that kind of event continue. And we did not speak again before she left. Still have the notebook. I don't take it out often. When I do, I read the names in the order she read them, from the 1st to the 31st, and I think about the room, and the water sound in the corridor outside, and the pace at which she walked, and the barley farm outside Port Cowan, and Ambassador Halvard's 14 pages that stayed closed on the table, and the silence in the chamber after she folded the paper. The Kirith Dominion has not destroyed a diplomatic courier since the Ardent. I do not know if that is because of the names, or the assessment, or the appropriate departments, or the border redeployment, or the trade terms, or the combination of all of those things working together in some way that no one event explains. Diplomacy rarely lets you isolate the variable. What I know is the sequence. The names were read, and the thing did not happen again. No empire, in my experience, files a rebuttal to a list of its own names. They never need to. The names speak for themselves. They always have. That was the point. That was the only point. It was enough.